this is what I'm going to talk about. First of all, just a few words about myself. Then I want to talk about how this presentation came about, because it has an interesting history of its own. And then I'm going to get into the subject matter itself, about the alternative attitudes amongst the British Jewish community in the years running up to the Balfour Declaration. So, as I said, I'm going to start with just a little bit about myself. I was born in Pakistan, where I've lived in the UK since 1952, and my professional background is as a tax advisor. But I had some interest in history all my life. Starting as a teenager, I read 4.5 volumes of Winston Churchill's 6-volume history of the Second World War, for example. I mean, my formal history education stopped with getting GCE O-level at the age of 17. I got interested in history teaching at a quasi sort of serious level in 2012, when I was involved with a charity that I'm still involved with called Curriculum for Cohesion, because we were putting in a response to the government, which was then undertaking a review of the national the entire national curriculum, but the bit that we were interested in was the history curriculum, because of course the history that a nation tells itself is very much its own identity. Just as I, Mohammed Amin, I'm really the sum total of my own personal memories. In retirement, I taught myself how to build a website, mohammedamin.com, and on that website I've got a number of presentations about all kinds of things, but including the Israel-Palestine dispute. And if my recording works okay, this talk that I'm giving tonight will also end up on that website. So first of all, how this presentation came about. And this slide here is a salutary reminder to me about how untrustworthy my own memory can be. Because if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, before I started preparing these slides, I would have given you a story something along the lines of, I read a review in the Jewish Chronicle that made me buy the book because the Balfour Declaration was coming up, and then I read it. That's completely false. When I checked on Amazon, which allows you to find out exactly when you bought a book from Amazon, I bought this book on the 2nd of August 2010, long before the Jewish Chronicle reviewed it in 2016. In November 2016 is when Vernon Bogdanor wrote a review of it. I normally buy books because I've read a review in either The Economist, which I subscribe to, or the New York Review of Books, or indeed the Jewish Chronicle. Searching the websites of The Economist and the New York Review of Books, they have never reviewed this book. So I can't explain what it was that made me buy it in 2010. But I'm pretty confident that I didn't read it at that time, that I only read it after seeing the review by Vernon Bogdanor, and I said to myself, I've actually got that book already, why don't I read it? The centenary is coming up. And when I did read it, I was rather shocked by some of the attitudes that I read about, because that ties into the next half of the genesis of the presentation. I've spent many years looking hard at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of antisemitism. I even knew it in its previous incarnation when it was put together by the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. And in November of 2017, I wrote an article for the Conservative Home website about the definition, which is now copied onto my own website in an expanded version since January of 2018. And tonight's talk is not about the IHRA definition, although we are going to look in a moment at 2 of the examples from the definition. But I do want to say in passing, and I'm happy to talk about the definition during the question and answer session if you want, my view is that most people on either side of the Israel-Palestine dispute, in other words, people who are passionately pro-Israeli or people who are passionately pro-Palestinian generally misunderstand the definition because they ignore how the definition is actually physically built and how the examples are connected with the definition, because the definition is extremely short and it's not on this slide. And then there is some text which introduces the examples. And I've got here the text introducing examples, and I put part of it in red, which most people tend to ignore. But what I'm interested in for today's talk is just two of the examples. This is under the definition, is a possible marker of anti-Semitism. And I'll just give you a couple of moments to read it on screen rather than me reading it out. I hate having a slide and then reading out the slide unless you particularly want me to. So, but this is a prima facie marker of anti-Semitism. So, example 6, accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel than they are to their own countries. It's a potential marker of anti-Semitism. Right. And then this one, example 7, basically trying to deny Jews their right to self-determination and arguing that the existence of an Israeli state is itself a racist endeavor. So those are relevant to what happens when we start looking at some of the attitudes. So now I'm going to go back to the period around about 1915. The First World War is underway, and in Jews in Britain, 1913, there were about 300,000 Jews, about half of whom lived in London. So as we can see, nothing ever changes. The population of Jews in Britain now is about the same sort of number, maybe 50,000 more, but it's a community that hasn't changed particularly in size, and again, heavily weighted towards London. And the social top of this community were some people who were known at the time, casually, as the cousinhood, because they were all related. Rothschilds, Montefiores, Macatas, Cohens, I've got a typo, Samuels, Montagues. They tended to marry each other, and Schneer, in his book, makes the point that they thought of themselves as Jewish Britons rather than as British Jews. In other words, British people who just happened to be Jewish. And Zionism was very much a minority activity. There were 3 separate Zionist organizations, and despite having watched the life of Brian, I'll avoid the temptations to make jokes along those lines. There was the English Zionist Federation, which was the official UK branch of the World Zionist Organization, and it had about 4,000 paying members. And their focus very much was on establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. There was something called the Jewish Territorial Association, which had about the same sort of membership as the English Zionist Federation, but their main focus was on saving Jews in Romania and Russia and getting them out to places of safety, regardless of whether that place of safety was Palestine or the United States or anywhere else. The focus was very much on helping to rescue East European Jews. And then within the English Zionist Federation was a sort of subgroup of people who Schneer talks about as practical or cultural Zionists. They were much more interested in how people were going to live in Palestine, what they were going to do, so Jewish culture. And they eventually moved into a different organization called the Ancient Order of Maccabeans. So 3 Zionist organizations with different degrees of emphasis at that time. And there was something founded in 1878 called the Conjoint Foreign Committee of British Jews, whose role was to liaise primarily with the British government about issues of foreign policy. And one reason this thing existed is that the Jewish community at that time was divided, rather like now. And the Board of Deputies, democratic organization, delegates from elected by synagogues, although Schneer makes the point that it was very much dominated, the Board of Deputies, by the cousinhood. But then there was this other organization, and it reminds me very much of the Jewish Leadership Council, the Anglo-Jewish Association, which were individual members. You could become a member of this simply by paying the subscription, but it was a pretty high subscription, and it was focused on UK and foreign anti-Semitism. And the Conjoint Foreign Committee, the CFC, brought these two organizations together on exactly even sort of power balance, 6 members from each side, to work with the government. And Schneer again makes the point that the way that people thought about themselves varied between these different subgroups of Jews. The Board of Deputies felt that British Jews were a distinct entity of some kind within Britain. Zionists were much more categorical. They thought of Jews as a distinct nation, with the emphasis being on the word nation. While the Anglo-Jewish Association, primarily drawn from wealthy people, thought of Jews as people who were Britons who just happened to be Jewish. Very different emphasis. And now to our first politician, Herbert Samuel. And it's interesting just how long a life this person had. Starting in 1870, he lived through everything, dying in the swinging 60s. He was the first Jew, a practicing Jew, to serve in the cabinet. Because, of course, Disraeli had been prime minister, but Disraeli had been baptized as a Christian at the age of 12. And Samuel was pro-Zionist. And in November of 1914, he lobbied the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor Exchequer, because by then the war had started. And of course, Palestine at that stage was ruled by Ottoman Turkey. He already wanted Britain to take over Palestine so it could be the place for establishing a Jewish state. And he wrote a memorandum in January of 1915, initially given just to Grey and to the Prime Minister Asquith, but then presented to the entire full cabinet, in which he said that the UK should annex Palestine from Ottoman Turkey, encourage Jewish immigration, and he deliberately toned it down about a Jewish state. He talked about the possibility of establishing some kind of Jewish self-governing organization there because he didn't want to come on too strong, although it's quite clear from the details that Schneer has looked at that what he really wanted was the establishment of a Jewish state. His cousin, Edwin Montagu, at that stage was also in the government. He was a minister again from 1909, but only entered the cabinet in 1915. And he was part of a group that Schneer refers to as assimilationists. He very much thought of himself purely as a Briton who practiced the Jewish religion. And in the cabinet, it wasn't the non-Jews. I mean, Montagu and Samuel were the two Jews in the cabinet. It was Montagu who was the person who was most outspoken against Herbert Samuel's memorandum. And after speaking out against the memorandum, he also wrote a letter to the Prime Minister on the 16th of March. And I've got here 2 extracts from the letter, which are worth reading slowly, if you can see them. As you can see, the first extract, he was very skeptical about Jews really being one people. As far as he was concerned, British Jews had nothing in common with Moroccan Jews or Indian Jews, because this contrast between the Christian Englishman and the Hindu of India, I mean, how much more different could you get? And then the second one, and this is the one that really hit me when I read this book, that the reason why Jews feel that they are entitled to be treated properly in countries in Europe is because that's the only home that they got. If you live in Spain, you're Spanish. And if a Jewish state was created in Palestine and that Jews really all belonged in Palestine, he could see countries in Europe wanting to get rid of them. Now, bear in mind, this is 1915, and of course, long before any sort of thoughts about the Holocaust, but there had already been massive and were ongoing significant pogroms in Russia. And it's also quite sobering when you read this second quote and think about what happened in the Arab states. I mean, none of the discussion in this book says anything about the Jewish communities in Arab states, but what happened after the establishment of the State of Israel and the way that Arab states reacted with their Jewish populations, it's really sort of sobering. So that was Montagu strongly opposed to Herbert Samuel's Zionist proposals, both trying to influence the policy of the British government. Now, our third character is a journalist called Lucian Wolff, who also was clearly an assimilationist, and he was the director, so the member of staff of the Conjoint Committee, and there was a crunch meeting between the Conjoint Committee and the British Zionist leadership, which at that stage by then already included Chaim Weizmann, in April of 1915, and he took notes. And his notes record in particular that the committee posed two questions to the Zionists. These were questions really posed by the assimilationist side, the ones who didn't want Zionism. How are you going to make Palestine Jewish? And would you want special rights for the Jews once they've gone into Palestine? Moses Gaster at that time was the head of the Sephardi community, and he was a Zionist. He was present at this meeting, and he spoke for the Zionists. And this is the way that Schneer summarizes the response that Moses Gaster gave, and in italics I've got the direct quotes. I'll read this out to you. The Zionists did not mince words in reply. So this is Schneer talking. The Zionists did not mince words in reply. Special rights would be asked for and would be necessary, Gaster explained. And then quoting from Gaster, as written down in the notes taken by Lucian Wolff, special rights would be necessary till the Jews were so numerous and in so large a minority, and it's interesting they use the word minority. I think he must have meant majority, but the notes say minority, that they would predominate by weight of numbers. And then back to Schneer's own words, as to how the Jews should enter Palestine, a Jewish chartered company, chartered companies were very popular in those days, like the old East India Company, a Jewish chartered company with Britain's backing. And now, again, quoting from Lucian Wolff's memorandum, would take care that the Jews should be the prevailing settlers. And then somebody called Sokolov, who was Nahum Sokolov, who was the London representative of the World Zionist Organization, Sokolov added that if Britain established some form of control over Palestine, again quoting from Lucian Wolff's notes, she would clearly and obviously take such necessary steps as to secure that the Jews should be the predominant people in Palestine and that it should be their, and the emphasis is in Schneer's book as well as just on my screen, it should be their country. The one point followed from the other. That takes me back to the other thing I had, the two examples from the IHRA definition. So how do I summarize all this? Because there's obviously a lot more detail in Schneer's book. It's a 400-page book, but there's no point going into it. I think we've covered the main underlying divide that there was amongst British Jews at that time. And I was reminded when I'd finished about a quote which I've used quite often, but again, it helps to look at the quote exactly, because otherwise people tend to sort of misquote it. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And this is a quote from a novel written in 1953 by an American. But it's a really helpful reminder to all of us, because it's so easy to judge people in the past by the standards of today. And the reality is that the way that you and I see the world now is conditioned both by our life experiences and by all the things that have happened in the world between 1915 and now. And it's entirely wrong to judge people like Winston Churchill, for example, who, you know, you often get a question these days in the culture wars: was Winston Churchill a great war hero, or was he a racist? The answer, of course, is quite simple. He was both. But at the time that Winston Churchill was a racist, just about everybody in British society at his social level was also a racist. So it's hard to fault him for that. But I did really find very interesting when I read this book, which is why I wanted to do a talk about it, how different were the views between the two groups of people, and how the people who were opposed to Zionism also pinpointed quite strongly the disadvantages and the possible consequences in the rest of the world should the Zionists get their way. So that's all I wanted to say, but I'm happy to take questions on this, or indeed anything else you want to ask me about.